Hello everyone! It's time for another installment of the Jane Eyre adaptation comparison series, and this time we're going to take a look at the scene at the end of chapter 22 of Charlotte Bronte's novel, where Jane returns to Thornfield and is met partway by Rochester. It is a short scene, and I guess you could say it's a little fluffy, but at this point in the story, we could use a pick-me-up. Jane's just had a wretched reunion with her aunt who hated her, and her cousins who disdained her, and while she forgave these people and made peace with them, the visit was far from pleasant. So when Jane makes her way on foot to Thornfield and approaches the turnstile to find Rochester waiting there, it's definitely a welcome diversion. The dialogue here is light, even as Rochester chastises her for staying away much longer than was promised, but even that is done in a teasing, I'm angry with you but not really way. And keep in mind that Jane didn't specify when she'd be returning, so if we assume that Rochester was waiting for her, he must have been on the lookout for days. Jane is all shook up seeing him again, of course, but she covers it pretty well, even when Rochester starts talking about the new carriage he just bought for the future Mrs. Rochester. Jane's been in contact with Mrs. Fairfax, so she knows that the guests left and Rochester went to London and bought this carriage for his intended bride. Rochester's dealing out a lot of doublespeak here, which you might not pick up on if it's your first time reading or watching the scene. He's being rascally and purposely ambiguous again, not really saying anything specific, but letting Jane draw her own conclusions and make erroneous assumptions, which is kind of bad, but I don't see it as mean-spirited so much as the misguided effort of an insecure man who's been burnt before, who doesn't really have a clue how to woo the object of his affections under awkward circumstances. The conversation closes with two lines you'll find in most adaptations of this scene. One is Rochester's "stay your weary little wandering feet at a friend's threshold," and the other is Jane's impulsive and warm expression of her gratitude. It's partly prompted by the lonely, miserable situation she just came from, and partly by the bittersweet joy and pain of seeing him again and knowing her time with him is probably limited. Jane turns to go, but stops and says, "Thank you, Mr. Rochester, for your great kindness. I am strangely glad to get back again to you, and wherever you are is my home. My only home." That is quite a bold statement for a single young woman to make to a man at that time, especially her employer. Now let's take a look at what the adaptations do. Of course, when you're watching one of these adaptations, like a normal person, it hasn't been over 8 months since you last saw Rochester. I had no idea that it had been such a long time since I did the Leave of Absence episode, but I looked it up last night, and I posted that video on May 25th of 2019. So, yikes. I will definitely be staying more on schedule from this point on. So keep in mind that the last time Jane saw him, he was acting a little cryptic, and each adaptation had its own idea of cryptic apparently, as in some versions he was angry or annoyed that she insisted on leaving, in others he was depressed, and in others it was an opportunity to get flirtatious. In this scene, Rochester is more consistent and playful, and with the adaptations, if I don't love Rochester at least a little bit in this scene, even though he's being a rascal, something's not right. As for Jane, she experiences quite a few different emotions here, but doesn't necessarily show them. She's not the type to wear her heart on her sleeve, at least she shouldn't be, so compared to Rochester here, she's pretty restrained. I am getting a break in this adaptation comparison. We can skip 1934, since Jane didn't leave to see her aunt. At least, I don't think she did. Honestly, I didn't go back and check. We can skip 1944, since the timing of Jane leaving Thornfield and going to Gateshead has changed. And we can skip 1970, since the aunt isn't even a character here, and therefore Jane doesn't go see her. So we're starting with the 1973 version. This scene occurs at the beginning of episode 4. As I've said before, this version uses a lot of voiceover to convey Jane's thoughts, and this is another instance where there's a lot of that, since Jane's not able in this scene to express her conflicted emotions. I still feel divided about the amount of narration. On the one hand, I like the inclusion of the information, but on the other, Jane's internal monologuing can get distracting and disruptive. But hey, that's how we learn what she found out from Mrs. Fairfax, so you win some, you lose some. Anyway, that aside, I really like the acting here. It's one of Jason's sassiest scenes, and like many of you, I find Jason's sassy Rochester very endearing. Rochester says a lot of fantastical nonsense when he reproaches Jane for her extended absence, echoing things he said on previous occasions. Almost as soon as she sees him, Jane seems to steel herself, resolved to stay distant and disciplined. Notice how she keeps a safe space between them, wary of his warmth and her own feelings of attraction. But her relief and pleasure at seeing him again can't be completely tamped down. There's a moment when Rochester's expression softens, the teasing stops, he uses the nickname Janet, and says his parting line. I think his gentleness here tips her over the edge. She goes through the gate and then stops to thank him, faltering a little at the word kindness, as if there's so much she's grateful for that she can't say, and kindness doesn't nearly cover it. Then, when she's said the home line, she kind of breaks a little and must rush away. In a similar way, 1983 starts with Jane walking back, not on a road, but through a field. She stops when she sees Rochester sitting there, and she starts to turn away, as she does in the book, but he looks up and sees her. I really like the acting in this version of the scene as well, even though it's totally different from how Cusack and Jaston played it. Rochester's greeting is very understated and informal, especially for Dalton's Rochester, just a simple hello. He may act testy and impatient, but his use of the phrase, "if you please," calling to mind a previous conversation, is telling. Jane approaches him slowly, even cautiously, like he's an unpredictable animal, or maybe it's herself that she's not sure of, but Rochester's teasing coaxes a smile out of her, and I always love that in this version, the exchange of irrepressible smiles, even though Rochester is trying to scold her here for staying away so long and forgetting him. This exchange is so them. He's cryptic and slightly mocking and pretending to be irritated, while she's unperturbed and parries every thrust, keeping her face still and serious, but responding playfully with her eyes. Instead of writing here, he's sketching something. When she approaches, he starts to sketch her instead. When he's finished, he folds it up and sets it aside to do who knows what with. It's just Rochester being mysterious, you know. Clark's Jane is more subdued when she makes her parting speech, almost a little melancholy, something that seems to strike Rochester. Both Cusack and Clark offer a very different reading of the same line, but they're equally in earnest. So we just looked at two relatively similar interpretations of the scene, and I guess that means it's time to shake things up. The 96 version gives us a short scene of Rochester with Adele in the schoolroom looking at Jane's sketch of him and tentatively allowing Adele to get close, so we see that he is making an effort to let the little girl in. Then there's this shot of Rochester, presumably waiting for Jane's return, but he might also just be musing over all his problems. Jane then walks up to the house to be greeted enthusiastically by Adele, which is very sweet until Adele tells her she's being sent away to school in Paris. Rochester then comes out, and his reception of Jane is hard to determine. They exchange just a few lines.
So you came back after all?
As I promised.
As you promised.
So are they glad to see each other? I'm sure some other viewers interpret this differently, maybe see some kind of electricity here, but I'm not getting it. I believe I mentioned last time, or maybe I didn't, I don't remember, that I think this scene in the 97 version is one of the better scenes in the adaptation. How they handled Jane's departure and her aunt's death was disappointing, but, well, they do let us have this. Jane approaches the house after the fade to black, happy as a clam to be home again, when she's verbally accosted by Rochester perched on top of whatever you call this structure. It's a little hard to tell if he's genuinely angry or not, but some of the lines, which aren't from the book, are just too funny, like explain to me the concept of the 28-day week, and I dare say even Pilate had a letter. And Jane is very cute when she's struggling to repress a laugh. The mood shifts when Mrs. Fairfax, Adele, and Sophie rush to greet her, and Rochester watches from a distance. I think Jane's responsiveness and just the buzz and euphoria of seeing her face again is a little too much for his patience, because he decides he has to declare himself right then and there and insists she take a walk with him. Jane, intrigued, obliges, even though everybody else protests that Jane should rest after her trip. So, there you go, immediate segue into the next big scene. She didn't even get to go to the bathroom after her long walk. Ugh, sorry, I can't help thinking that. With the last two adaptations, we go back into more standard territory, although both 2006 and 2011 put their own stamp on it. In the 2006 version, Jane rides partway to Thornfield and gets out to walk, and cinematically the moment is very sweeping and uplifting, giving you the sense there was something cathartic about her journey. She comes across Rochester and pretends not to notice him, but she doesn't get away before he turns and calls out to her. Their exchange is brief, but has the right substance, Rochester insisting he wants his money back, and Jane responding in kind. It's all very jocular, until Jane thanks him and says the line about her true home, which makes Rochester pause thoughtfully. You might think the scene's over, and it is, but it isn't. They walk back and encounter Eshton, the guest obsessed with studying twin connections, getting ready to leave. The point they were building all along with the many guest conversations is driven home.
You don't think it possible that two minds can be so in tune that they communicate across the country?
Oh, and Jane and Rochester look and act so much like a couple, it's almost scandalous. In the book, the guests are already long gone, but here they're still in the process of packing. We get a little exchange between Rochester and the Ingrams. Mrs. Ingram doesn't know that things are over between her daughter and Rochester, so that's awkward. Then there's a scene in the library where Jane puts her favorite book from Gateshead on Rochester's shelf, something you might do when you're in a committed relationship. Not sure if it's appropriate here, and I've gotta say her timing is a little strange, given that she fears he'll be marrying Blanche soon. Speaking of timing, at this point I'm thinking, okay, the next scene's gonna be the proposal, right? But then there's another scene, and another scene, and another! I'm fine with a scene or two of buffer material, time does pass in the book, but at this point it's like, I'm ready! It is nice that they have these short scenes where they talk about Jane's family and her future, and then the new carriage arrives and we finally get that dialogue, and then there's a scene where Rochester tells Adele about the West Indies and we get a Bertha flashback. Actually, I don't care for this scene, especially the way it ends, with Rochester freaking out at Adele. Yeah, this Adele is annoying, but when Rochester loses his temper, it really makes me cringe. Oh, and then there's a scene with Jane and Mrs. Fairfax talking about how much time has gone by with no visit to Blanche Ingram, and I'm saying, get on with it! Which it does after this. It's all a very different way to handle this section of the book. From the longest, most drawn out, to the opposite extreme, 2011 keeps it short and to the point. Jane walks back and comes upon Rochester, who comments on how typical it is of her to steal in along with the twilight. We get his wandering feet line and her thank you line, although she doesn't say that anywhere he is her home. I guess that might have come across as a little out of character here, maybe? And that's it! Just a few lines of welcome, followed by Mrs. Fairfax talking about Rochester's impending nuptials. You could probably watch the scene in less time than it takes me to comment on it. So to conclude, for me, it's the oldies but goodies. I know, shocking. They are the only ones where Jane says she's just been with her aunt who is dead, and he says, a true Janie in reply. I always love that line. It did not get past me, though, that none of the adaptations included Rochester's use of the word gloaming. I love that word, and I love that it's used in the book, so I definitely noticed its absence. Or the second part of Jane's response when he asks if she has a charm to make him handsome. Some of the adaptations have her say it would be past the power of magic, sir, but nobody includes what she goes on to say, which is, a loving eye is all the charm needed. To such you are handsome enough, or rather your sternness has a power beyond beauty. It's another somewhat forward comment for Jane to make, and revelatory in its complimentary nature. It's interesting that none of the adaptations include it. Alright everyone, share your favorite version of this scene in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and it's time to start preparing for the next one, which is gonna be a doozy. I am excited and I feel overwhelmed even though I haven't started working on it yet. It's a long scene and it's in every adaptation and there's so much to talk about. But before then, I do have another Jane Eyre related review that I'm hoping to do in the next week or two, so I will see you then. Thanks for watching!